大家好，我们的水古今啊 Wagi Shyac， 欢迎收看伊达看世界英语论坛，我是 Wagi。Welcome to the IDA See the World English Forum. I'm Wagi.
I'm Rath, today's co-host.
Since taking office in January, President Donald Trump has triggered a major shift in European Union's foreign and economic strategies. In response, the EU is adjusting its approach toward both the US and China, seeking to assert greater strategic autonomy as tensions between Washington and Beijing rise with the trade war.
Is the EU preparing to chart its own course between two superpowers? Will the tariffs pause lead to resolution or retaliation? And could Taiwan emerge as Europe's next key partner?
In this episode of IDA Insight, we break down the latest developments in US and EU defense capabilities, their impact on the war in Ukraine, look at Brussels' shifting strategy amid US-China tensions, and explore how Taiwan is working closer with Europe.
Joining us today are Mark Zheng, Executive Director of European Union Center in Taiwan.
Hello, everyone.
William Stanton, former American Institute in Taiwan Director.
Hello.
Yavor A. Konstantinov, Mingchuan University International College Assistant Professor.
Hello, a pleasure to be here.
Welcome, everyone. Since President Donald Trump returned to office in January 2025, transatlantic relations have entered a new phase. Our first question goes to Ambassador Stanton. Since President Trump took office earlier this year, how have EU-US relations evolved? Ambassador?
Well, my own view is actually they've kind of devolved. The relationships overall between the European Union and President Trump are increasingly problematic. There's been increasing difficulties, a lack of alignment and approaches to key issues, both in Europe and globally. So it's been a difficult path forward for both sides.
President Macron's recent diplomatic tour of Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam highlights France's proactive engagement in Southeast Asia. His visit comes amid a broader trend of growing European involvement in the Indo-Pacific, evident in Germany's naval presence in the Philippines and also the Taiwan Strait, and the UK's deepening defense ties with Japan and the Philippines. Director Zheng, what does this tell us of European strategy in terms of the Indo-Pacific?
I would say that, actually the EU have its Indo-Pacific strategy. But remember, the first country, if we actually be advocating the Indo-Pacific strategy, is actually France. The France have its own overseas territory in the region. They are basically, the regional country, because they have territory in the region. So actually, it's also under the Macron's insisted that EU have this Indo-Pacific strategy. So you can tell that actually President Macron really played a very important role. So when the President Macron actually visited the regions, joined the Shangri-La Dialogue and visited Vietnam, Indonesia, and also Singapore together. Actually, they want to show to a stronger presence in the region, because usually the people think that EU is very good in policy, regulation, but how about the capacity? So I think, the President Macron's visit shows that, the France, not only France, the EU actually try to have a stronger presence in the region with a character with familiar, safe, and reliable, compared to other great powers in the region.
So how about Ambassador? Do you have any comments to add?
Well, in general, I'm happy that the EU, that France in particular, is taking more of an interest in East Asia. I think all countries in the world have increasingly a sense of a threat that China may represent to democracies around the world. And so I appreciate and welcome the involvement of France increasingly in Asia, and indeed in wherever else the French might be interested in playing a role. I think that's a welcome development.
Okay. In response to rising global tensions and an increasingly volatile security landscape, the European Union has unveiled Readiness 2030, an ambitious 800 billion euros defense plan for European defense, formerly known as Rearm Europe. As a key pillar of EU strategic autonomy, it also reflects Europe's intent to better respond to threats on its eastern flank and in the Indo-Pacific. And Professor Kostadinov, what prompted the emergence of the Rearm Europe Readiness 2030? What do you think?
First, I have to say that this is the step in the right direction. The plan signals unity, and it could serve as deterrent. It is, in my view, long overdue. It should have happened many years ago, particularly after Russia's takeover of Crimea. But the problem with the European Union in terms of security is the lack of internal cohesion in terms of threat perception, in terms of control of the troops, interoperability, different types of mobility and deployment of the troops. The European Union does have a permanent structured framework for cooperation and security, or for short PESCO. It's enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty in 2007, but it was only activated in 2017. Now, if we look in detail and the commitments of the member states in terms of security, we can focus on two that are crucial for joint projects or for this kind of development of cooperation. One of them is, for instance, the joint procurement of arms. And then this could give the European Union more power in terms of purchasing power. However, we see that there has been decline rather than increase of cooperation on that front. Different countries would have their individual interests, so they could not really agree on common interests in terms of how to purchase weapons, for instance, from the United States. On the other hand, we also have joint projects towards research, development, and also collaboration in security. But then we also see here, despite their commitment to contribute from their budgets, they do not increase in that direction towards the joint product. They increase their individual budgets for defense, but not really for joint projects. I think this exposes vulnerability of the European Union in terms of security. It's all good that they have normative coherence, and now they speak with one voice, and the Rearm project is also a step in the right direction, as I said. However, we need to understand that there is a big disunity on threat perception. Take, for instance, Poland, right? Poland, on one hand, sees Russia as aggressor, as an enemy. On the other hand, Hungary perceives Russia as a benign and treats it in a very neutral way. Now, take, for instance, how Poland perceives NATO, and it over-relies, in my opinion, on the United States' help there, right, and other countries as well, on NATO. So they perceive it, as Poland used to say, as home. But then we have France, who declared that NATO is brain dead. So this kind of internal divisions and the inability to speak with one voice, it is a pretty good weakness that we observe. And in my opinion, the European Union, although it has this step in the right decision, is very far from obtaining the desired autonomy and security so that it could stand on the world stage, on the global stage, as an autonomous actor.
Ambassador Stent, given all these divisions, but do you see Readiness 2030 as a result of Trump 2.0?
Absolutely. I mean, what's happened is, I think, because President Trump has not expressed strong interest in NATO or in reinforcing it, it's inevitable that the European countries have turned inward toward one another to find alternatives for their own security.
So now turning to the Russia-Ukraine war. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the European Union has been a key pillar of Ukraine's defense economically, militarily, and diplomatically. EU countries, alongside NATO allies, have supplied billions in aid and weapons, implemented sweeping sanctions against Moscow, and provided refuge to millions of displaced Ukrainians.
Ambassador Stanton, how do you see the current negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, given the unpresence or the lack of European presence?
Well, what I say is what negotiations? Because the U.S. has really altered U.S. policy toward Ukraine. In the past, the U.S. was a key pillar of support for Ukrainians in the face of Russian aggression. The fact that President Trump, in the famous meeting also with Vice President Vance, in which they paraded President Zelensky of Ukraine about not having any cards to play in a war with Russia, it's clear that U.S. support, both symbolically and literally, has diminished for Ukraine. I personally would like to see more support for a country I regard as a democracy, a country that is aligned with Western interests. But President Trump, who regards Putin as a friend, which I find hard to believe, has taken a different position. So right now, the entire U.S. Policy toward Ukraine tends to be up in the air. It's uncertain. It seems to have changed over time. And of course, this has been created great difficulties for the Ukrainians themselves, not only in terms of moral diplomatic support, but also in terms of the weapons they can rely on, as well as the intelligence that can be shared with them. So it appears that there's been a diminished amount of that kind of sharing from the U.S. And so it's also incumbent, I think, on the Europeans have to step up, and I think they're doing that, to provide more support for Ukraine.
Since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Beijing has refused to contain Moscow, and many see China as supporting the Kremlin. And Professor Kostadinov, how does Europe view China's role in the Ukraine war? And is this reshaping attitudes towards Beijing?
The European Union tried to speak with a unified voice, but from the get-go they had issues. We saw the former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visiting Beijing for business deals, despite objections by France and others. Then we have Hungary and Greece that have a vested interest and in their economic ties with Beijing. So again, we do not have the necessary cohesion to speak with unified voice here in terms of threats and external actors. And then we have obviously, however, some changes. So there's division. On one hand, we have Czech Republic and the Baltics, which definitely changed stance, right? They felt that the fact that China did not even call the Russo-Ukrainian war a war and kind of tried to talk the rhetoric of Putin and Russia, then they saw that as not enough. So they've changed tack and they started engaging the Republic of China, the government in Taiwan, and warming ties with that. I recall that China used to have very close relations with Czech Republic, for instance. There's a lot of tourism, a lot of economic ties before the war. And thereafter, we see re-engagement with Taipei now. So also we saw the Baltic countries drop out of the framework for cooperation, the 16+1, which now it's 14+1, China's framework for economic ties in Central Eastern Europe. And then this is definitely an impact from China's position on the war. On the other hand, as I mentioned, we have Greece, Hungary, even Germany that are reluctant to directly call on China and to sanction it or to, but they try to have a central unified voice that if China would to actively support Russia, then there will be reputational damages and consequences towards their actions, right?
Director Chung, we talked about China, and let's talk about its top competitor, the U.S. Given Donald Trump's role in the ceasefire, and Ambassador Stanton mentioned a diminished role of the U.S. in the entire conflict. How are European leaders reacting to Donald Trump? Are they stepping up?
I would say that, of course, the Trump administration, they bring some instability factors, unstable factors, to this, Russia-Ukraine war. From very supportive, Biden administration to less supportive, or even, say that they want to end this war, to quit, this war is not belong to the United States. So I think to the EU or Europe leader, they a little bit worry about, without the U.S. presence in this war, what can, Europe can, face this crisis alone. Obviously, they don't want to know the answer so far because they see their capacity. They say it's not enough. So definitely we have to keep the United States in Europe, no matter what Trump say or what the Trump administration say. They say the U.S.-EU relation is the first priority for the EU. Everything the EU have to do is to enhance the U.S.-EU relations. Ceasefire is another thing. Of course, the people might say Europe is not in this negotiation, but don't forget that even with the presence of Europe in these negotiations, what can you say? Donald Trump definitely won't compromise from the Ukraine, but EU strongly support for Ukraine. So you cannot let EU say, okay, you compromise with Putin. No. So absence of Europe in this negotiation, in some sense, not a bad thing. Because the EU can show the support to whatever decision you take. We are always with you. So don't be afraid.
Now let's take a quick break. Please stay tuned.
Welcome back to ITA, See the World. Now let's talk about the U.S.-China trade war and Europe's role. The EU has closely observed China's unfair market practices. For national security and economic reasons, it placed import controls on Chinese electric vehicles and other commodities to protect its local markets. Ambassador Stanton, how is the EU responding to this, and why are its leaders uncomfortable with Beijing?
Well, I think President Trump would like to see more support and solidarity coming from the EU in terms of how we deal with trade with China, because I think, by and large, Chinese trade practices with everyone tends to be unequal. There's a lack of balance. So I think probably the Europeans have been privately cheerleading for the U.S. imposition of tariffs, although there's also been irregularity in the U.S. position on tariffs. They go up, they go down, and I understand July 7 is a new deadline for when Trump wants to see that there's progress on a trade agreement. Otherwise, more tariffs will be reimposed. So it's a very difficult situation for everyone, frankly. I think everyone feels that the trade with China has been out of balance, They'd like to introduce more equity in that relationship. But on the other hand, that's very difficult to do. And as we see, the U.S., which probably has the most leverage, up till now, I don't think has particularly succeeded in its trade war with China. I hope that changes. I think for too long, China's gotten away with too much. But you know, the thing is that China is an autocracy, so they can just order their entire society to do whatever they want. The United States has a lot of different stakeholders with different interests, private industries, some who have benefited, some who are suffering. And so it's a much more complicated equation for the United States than it is for China.
And Professor Kostadinov, we've seen restrictions on Chinese medical devices and EVs to Europe. So how is the US-China trade war shaping EU decisions? It's interesting.
Maybe it used to be US-China trade war, but of late it has become United States versus the world trade war, since the United States has been imposing tariffs to the left and to the right. So we should call it for what it is. First. Secondly, while the European Union is disunited, if you want, in security, it actually has a pretty stable and global market. So quite often people misunderstand or underplay that role. So obviously the European Union has its own interest in trade and also in economics, which would defend. And there was no surprise to me that when many countries lined up to cut deals with the United States after the Trump administration imposed those tariffs, China reciprocated immediately. And then if the European Union would have also aligned with the United States, then we could have kept calling it US-China trade war. However, European Union a few days later imposed tariffs on the United States of its own, meaning that they want and proved that they can stand on their own feet. And I believe that it was one of the major reasons why the United States then put the tariffs on hold and change their way. We will see what happens if they would be reimposed. But there were obviously other factors that led to that decision, but the timing is very telling. The timing was very telling that influenced the United States decision. On the other hand, the European Union has been also taming China in terms of trade. For instance, I've been doing some research on China's expansion towards the European Union, not only in terms of EVs or also medical equipment, but even if we go back 10 years and so, they have very comprehensive institutions that deal with trade in economic affairs in the European Union. If you take the 16+1 framework with Central Eastern Europe, now it's 14+1 because of the Baltic states living it, we can see that is a very sophisticated three-dimensional framework. It doesn't go government to government, it goes to the local levels with mayors and even below that. It also does not engage only those countries only in terms of economics, but in other areas. And on top of that, they also engage young people, future leaders of these countries. So it is very sophisticated and it is time-oriented. So did they succeed to get something out of that? There were a lot of shady deals, a lot of investment, yes, but then because of the lack of transparency, because of accusations of corruption and erosion of values, some even called that, then the European Union stepped back in and took control, imposed legislations, and also on top of it, then invested way more money in the Central and Eastern Europe. So there was a pushback, and by doing so, they tamed the desire of China to play a stronger role, even to use some of these economic advancements and institutions for what we call economic statecraft, or to gain some political advantages. Did they succeed? They had limited success. There were a couple of oppositions, particularly from Greece and Hungary, in terms of resolutions on human rights. infringement towards China. So they managed to stop that because, in the European Union, you need to have anonymous vote. But then when Greece and Hungary opposed that, then they couldn't pass those resolutions. But that was limited and it kind of finished because, now the European Union introduced those measures, right? So.
In early May, China and the EU marked 50 years of diplomatic relations, publicly affirming a shared interest in cooperations on issues such as climate change. Yet behind the scenes, as we've heard from the professor, tensions are mounting. Ambassador Stanton, how is the EU feeling towards its relationship with China, given conflicting values? Can it continue to work with China as it used to do?
I don't think so. As China grows in power, I don't think anyone can continue as before. I think China is increasingly powerful, it's increasingly rich, it's increasingly belligerent toward many. I think that we've passed a point where there can be a return to business as usual with China. I think the Europeans, like the United States, like other countries in the world, and certainly in Asia, there's a new growing fear of what China might do next, and growing difficulties of dealing with China, whether it's in terms of trade, whether in terms of territorial claims, whether in terms of who controls the high seas around various countries. I think all of these are going to be increasing sources of concern.
So, Director Jen, how does EU perceive China's strategy, and what does it expect to achieve in the upcoming EU summit in Beijing?
I would say, definitely there are three sets of, type of EU-China relations. Either is, a competitor or is a rival, right? Or a partner, which I think is not the case now. So either competitor or a rival. However, I think, at the same time, EU have a lot of issues need to cooperate with China. So I think, the difference between the United States and the EU is that EU taking a kind of de-risking approach. That is not decoupling that we don't talk to you, we impose everything, then force you to actually, follow us, right? We try to communicate with you, but it must be risk-free. Means that we talk something that we all agree on, that is benefits for each other, there's no risk for us. But there are some problems we have to resolve together. For example, economic competitiveness, global, production, kind of probably worry about China dumping, a lot of things to Europe, when they're facing, the tariff from the United States. So this kind of issues that EU want to go through this kind of high-ranking summit to put a framework or a kind of create a good atmosphere. I don't think EU expect any concrete result from this summit. They probably say, okay, people-to-people exchange, good. We have some trade-related issue, on the e-vehicle or others could be discussed during this summit. But I don't see there could be a kind of a comprehensive agreement on anything because I think that both sides still need a trust. Whether I can trust you, don't really, help Russia to invade Ukraine, whether I can really trust you, really the good partner, follow the market rule. I think, so far, I think EU didn't see any signal from China. They are willing to play a goodwill partner for the EU. So I think they are looking for a real partner in the summit.
And Professor, do you have any comments to add?
I think that de-risking might be possible for the EU, given its own power as a single market, but decoupling would be a mistake, and I don't think that at present it's even feasible, right? So that is just to add to that. Yeah, thank you.
Ambassador Stanton, as we heard from Professor Konstantinov, there's a deep difference between de-risking and decoupling. Given that it's a U.S. term, what exactly is this difference?
Well, I think it's meant to indicate that there's a difference between rupturing the relationship with China but minimizing the negative effects of policies that China brings with it that are not in favor of whether the United States or its allies or Europe. But the problem is that I think from the Chinese perspective, they review de-risking as an effort toward decoupling from China. And so I think for them, they just see it as a negative. For other countries, for the countries that deal with China, it's considered a positive way of dealing with a China that's very prickly, very difficult, which makes demands. So people want to continue to trade with China, but they'd like to do so in a fair and more balanced way.
So decoupling wouldn't be a red line for China, given that it sees it as one and the same?
Well, it would depend on which country it was. Many countries, I think China wouldn't care at all. But other countries are very important to China. These include major countries in Europe, in Asia, certainly in the United States. So, I think that we tend to put too much emphasis on these terms. Everybody, in a sense, wants a good relationship with China, but everyone wants a fairer relationship, a more balanced relationship. The question is whether China is willing to make sufficient changes to create a more balanced trading equation for the world.
Let's now take a quick break.
Welcome back to Ida See the World. I'm Wagi. Now let's shift the topic toward how Taiwan is pursuing increasing cooperation with Europe, especially in the areas of semiconductors and supply chains.
Former President Tsai Ing-wen made her second trip since stepping down to Europe this May, visiting Lithuania, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. Her message to the continent was, Taiwan and Europe must stand together in defending democracy. Professor Konstantinov, how do you feel Europe and its leaders see her visit?
Yes, I read about her visit to the European Union and to the three countries you mentioned. Now, I see that they responded in a positive way, yet limited. Now, there has been growing support for Taiwan. The European Union last year, towards the end, introduced Resolution 2891, which encourages all member states to engage with Taiwan and deepen the ties at the European level as well. So this is all very good. And why is it limited, however, the response? I believe because many of the states still do not know, they're not aware of Taiwan's strengths. Many of them know, okay, Taiwan is a democracy, there are some semiconductors now that they are very, in the news, but they're unaware of Taiwan's strengths. However, on the other hand, they have the big market across the strait, and then obviously they want to balance that. So they don't want to be too overhyped, over-supportive towards Taiwan. Now, also she called for democratic alliance. Now, I have to say that I'm excited that the European Union and Europe are getting closer and deepen ties. But I believe that it is not wise to overplay or overemphasize the democratic alliance. Now, why is that? We have democratic Ukraine, that it is destroyed by authoritarian state, but yet democratic Hungary does nothing. We have democratic United States that humiliates its leader in front of the whole world, and then withdraws support and engages with Russia as well to reapproach it. So while democratic values and freedom is very important, and I do believe, this is very clear, that for freedom-loving people, democracy is the best form of governance. While I do believe that, on the other hand, we need to be a little bit cautious, because if we think, some people might argue that Hungary and the United States are moving towards authoritarianism, sliding, that would indicate that that is a fluid concept, a process. Now, if we do that, then we need to also acknowledge that authoritarian states might be moving towards, some of them, towards democratization and democracy. Now, is it wise then to label and polarize, and then isn't that denying them the right to become democracies and obstructing them to become democracies? I believe that this polarization of democracies versus autocracies, I think that is harmful in general. It's most polarizations are divisive, and they're harmful in general.
Okay, still, we are seeing both moves in European tech and trade. And on one hand, Taiwan's President Lai recently called for a formal economic partnership with the EU, with growing momentum in the chip sector, like TSMC's new plans in Germany and expanding partnership with countries like Czech Republic and Poland.
But at the same time, Europe still engages China. Just last month, over 40 Chinese and European firms met in Beijing to talk supply chain security and rare earth exports, even as tensions grow over AI chip restrictions and pressure from Washington. Ambassador Stanton, could we see Europe move towards a Taiwan-EU trade agreement given tensions with China and everything going on?
Well, I'd certainly like to see that, although I think it's probably in the distance still. I mean, with all the talk about democracies and the commonality of democracies, I would note that Taiwan is still not recognized as a country by most countries in the world. There are some 13 small places, islands, that recognize Taiwan, and Taiwan is excluded because of the threat from China, from the World Health Organization, for other international bodies where Taiwan clearly has an important role to play. Certainly in disease prevention, for example, the WHO, and they're not allowed to come in because that would make them a country. I think that's the baby step, if you will, that we need to take first so that Taiwan finds its real place in the world. And that's going to be difficult. But I would like to see more countries working toward that goal.
But with the U.S., given Trump being different in his approach, for good or for bad, could it be a deal breaker? If Taiwan gives enough, like say the TSMC investment in the U.S. or other cookies, so to speak?
I don't, the problem with President Trump with regard to Taiwan is from everything he's said and done is I don't think he takes that much interest in Taiwan. And so I'm not so sure that there's anything that Taiwan could offer that the U.S. already doesn't take advantage of that would change his mind. It may be too transparent, but I mean, Biden 5 times said he would come to the defense of Taiwan. Trump won't even discuss that issue. So what he really thinks about Taiwan is still a mystery to me. I fear always that he seems to love the big and not respect the small. And for him, I suppose, Taiwan is not a major country, it's a small country. So that disturbs me. I just don't know that there's much that Taiwan could offer him that would change his mind. As we know, he always talks about Putin is a good friend. He has a great relationship with Xi Jinping. I don't know that he's ever met with a Taiwan representative. So this is a problem.
Okay, Director Jen, amid the ongoing U.S.-China semiconductor conflict, what do you see Europe is trying to define its role in this strategic rivalry? How do you see it?
I would say that, definitely, EU also want the semiconductor industries in Europe. But, the reason they want to have that industry is not to, pursue number one in the world. They don't want to compete with the United States or replace China in manufacturing all the chips. So I think for Europe, they want a safe minimum supply for the supply chain, which EU or Europe don't have yet. So I think that they try to get rid of this rivalry, to actually attract more people, including China, if they can help, including the United States, if they are willing to help. So all into Europe to rebuild their supply chain on semiconductors.
Including Taiwan.
Of course, since we are the leading group of these semiconductor industries.
And Professor Kostadanov, building on that, do you see the EU pursuing a more autonomous path in the semiconductor sector, or is it likely to align more closely with the US?
I believe that they do have the ambition to walk their own path. This is enshrined in the 2022 European Chips Act. And they are very ambitious. They would like to increase their market share to 20% from the current 10%, which should happen by 2030. And that has been already pointed by many that is probably unfeasible and unrealistic, right? I also believe that. So I also believe that maybe something more moderate, as Director Chen also said, something towards security of their own needs, de-risking at least in that sense. And also they will try to definitely ensure more security in terms of supply chains. For those, for those semiconductors and packaging and all this, right? So, to that end, there are two developments here. Number one is in the 2025, in March this year, a group of 9. The European Union quite often operates on what we call the coalitions of the willing, because quite often on many issues they might not reach a consensus, so they then allow for this kind of behavior. So we also saw that in the semiconductor sector, they built a coalition of 9 states, the big 4, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and then plus 5, including Austria, by the way. And then they emphasized that they would like to increase their competitiveness. So based on the rhetoric, based on the developments, I believe that they strongly signal and indicate that they would like to compete rather than follow the United States. And the second point is that they actually would like to engage United States, Korea, and Japan as partners, and then try to work with Taiwan, obviously, and China to find a way maybe to de-risk from them, but at the same time not to as well isolate. I think in that respect, to circle back a little bit on what Taiwan can do earlier, I was asked, and I didn't explain in detail, but in that sense, Taiwan could offer a lot more in terms of the know-how and security of the supply chains and all this. But also, I should also stress that Taiwan should offer way more than that. Take disinformation campaigns, for instance. Both the European Union and Taiwan are facing them, right? Especially on the eastern flank in Europe, and here in Taiwan. Taiwan and I believe Latvia was in Taiwan are the 2 most attacked places in the world by government-sponsored disinformation campaigns. There are multiple sources for that. And then I believe that that is where a lot of cooperation should. It is already happening with some forums, including United States, Sweden, and other countries. But I think it could be more on a formal level. And then other strategies that intelligence information could be shared is how to deal with gray zone operations, because the European Union as well is facing them. Taiwan has been dealt, in my opinion, slightly better, countering those. We see underwater sea cables being cut in Finland, around the Baltic states as well, here around Taiwan. Then we see sabotage in infrastructure and other in some other countries. That's why the European Union has been trying actually to expand its protections, put more financing into that this year, and then also trying to look to probably expand in the Black Sea via Bulgaria, Romania to protect their interests from there as well. But then they can learn from Taiwan or together with Taiwan as to how to counter those kind of gray zone threats more effectively. So that is another area of cooperation that could emerge.
Thank you.
Last but not least, given Professor Konstantinov's comments on how Taiwan could serve as a role model or even as something to learn from through Europe, given its growing importance or being caught on radar by EU leaders, how would such leaders respond in a Taiwan contingency? And this is a question for all of you. I'll start with you.
Of course, when we are in sort of crisis, we hope everyone could be on our side, help us, right? But I would say that it's not that realistic, to see, everyone will come without any consideration. They must consider that, Taiwan is a place they should come to defense, because at the same time they are defending themselves. So it's not defending Taiwan, but for them, exactly defend themselves, right? So of course, semiconductors, is one reason why the European leader would say, okay, we have to defend Taiwan, because without Taiwan, in 2 weeks, all the factory in Europe will close because we don't have a supply of the chips anymore. But apart from that, what else? So I mean that definitely, we expect, the two sides can engage, not, in the crisis, before the crisis, that, both sides will prevent this crisis happen, is what we expect, Europe leader can do. Don't wait until the thing happens, then you expect the other to do the things. It's better that, both sides join together, enhance, both mutual interest. I think, that's the experience we learned from Ukraine. That's why Europe defending or supporting Ukraine so much, because they don't want it happen again.
And Professor Konstantinov?
Now, when you say contingency, we need to really define what type of contingency, given that we have outright confrontations, we have quarantines, we have gray zone strategies and tactics. It could be economical, military, or otherwise, or cultural. So if you're talking about the likelihood of a direct confrontation in a military sense, first, I have to be very clear, I do not believe that at present that is a very likely scenario. However, if we have to entertain a hypothetical, I believe that we started today's talk with European Union disunity in security and their rightful steps in the right direction with those plans to unite. However, as I mentioned, I do believe that they are far from a position where they could offer a solid support for Taiwan in terms of security. So again, either a coalition of the willing, which is happening in Europe in support of Ukraine, could emerge. Few countries, more countries, or individual countries could support Taiwan in limited way with financial or military aid, right? But they do not expect that the European Union as a whole would take security measures to protect Taiwan. That is out of the question. So what can, if that's something the European Union cannot do, what can the European Union do as a whole? As a whole, I believe that they could use their economic strength, and they would be putting probably some form of sanction towards whoever dares to attack Taiwan. I believe that they've built enough goodwill and trust with Taiwan to do that, especially if it is unprovoked, and especially if it is in a very offensive way. So that would happen. And I also expect that there will be a lot of positive messages on the media and in public support as well towards Taiwan from the people-to-people relationships that are emerging, that are also very positive and deepening. Thank you.
Ambassador Stanton.
Well, if there's a threat to Taiwan, it's going to come from China. And when that happens, it's in the geostrategic interests of Japan, of South Korea, of the Philippines, Vietnam, as well as the United States to help Taiwan. Because otherwise, it's all of Asia becomes under the Chinese Communist Party control. And nobody wants that to happen. So I think actually there would be a coalition of the willing who have already expressed concerns about what China might do, about the threat to Taiwan. And I think it would very quickly, a coalition could develop to have their own say. We know that the cutting of cables, for example, has already had an impact in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. And, these countries are concerned about Chinese domination. And so I think actually there would be considerably more support for a threat to Taiwan than we've seen support for the Russian attack on Ukraine. That's my own position. And then, of course, I think the United States would also, because the U.S. considers the Pacific sort of its part of the ocean as well, the United States would feel very much compelled to play a role as well. So this is something that I think the Chinese government has to seriously consider when they talk about taking over Taiwan.
Thank you for your insights, Director Tseng, Ambassador Stanton, and Professor Constantino.
And that wraps up today's Idasila World English Forum. And thanks for watching. See you next time.